Review Podcast, periods 5 through 6 from 1844 to 1898. By 1848, the United States had done something dangerous to itself. It had grown faster than it had settled its arguments. In the last installment, the Republic expanded west, democratized politics for white men, built roads and canals, multiplied markets, and talked constantly about liberty. But under all that motion sat an older contradiction that had never really gone away. Who was liberty for? Who counted as fully American? Whether land would belong to small farmers or speculators, to slaveholders or free laborers, to native nations or white settlers moving under federal protection. Periods 5 and 6 are where those arguments stop sounding theoretical and start tearing through the whole national structure. This is the chapter where expansion becomes sectional crisis, where sectional crises becomes civil war, where civil war becomes a struggle over citizenship and federal power, and where the wreckage of that struggle hardens into industrial capitalism, Western conquest, labor unrest, urban poverty, and a new America that looks unmistakably modern and unmistakably unfinished. And the first thing to understand is that the Civil War does not begin in 1861. Not really. It begins the moment the United States keeps adding land without agreeing on what kind of society that land is supposed to support. And that is why manifest destiny matters so much. It was not just optimism. It was not just adventure. It was an ideology. It claimed that Americans, or more precisely, white Americans, had a providential mission to spread across the continent, to conquer it, settle it, organize it, and in their minds, civilize it. It drew on older language you have already heard before in this series. The city on a hill, the special mission, the belief that America stood for something larger than itself. But by the 1840s, that language had fused with white superiority, settler ambition, and territorial hunger. And once expansion becomes moralized, once people start calling conquest destiny, compromise gets harder because every map line begins to feel righteous. James K. Polk embodied that energy. He entered office with a program that looked precise and practical. Lower the tariff, saddle Oregon, annex Texas, acquire California. But underneath that checklist was a much bigger transformation. The United States was beginning to think continentally and aggressively. Texas had already exposed the problem. It had won independence from Mexico after rebellion tied to migration, slavery, and political conflict. Annexing it would not merely add land, it would alter the sectional balance. It would provoke Mexico. It would force the country to confront again the question it kept postponing. Would Western expansion strengthen slave power, weaken it, or blow up the political system trying to contain it? Oregon was resolved through negotiation with Britain at the 49th parallel, and that matters because students sometimes flatten expansion into a single story of violence. But expansion was not one thing. It could involve diplomacy in one theater and war in another. It could be negotiated where the United States faced a powerful rival it did not want to fight, and militarized where leaders believed a weaker neighbor could be pressed harder. Mexico became the latter case. Disputes over whether the border of Texas lay at the Nueces River or the Rio Grande created the immediate flashpoint. But the deeper issue was that Polk wanted far more than the security of Texas. He wanted California. He wanted a Pacific future. He sent John Slidell to attempt a purchase. Mexico refused. He sent Zachary Taylor into disputed territory. Fighting followed in 1846, and Polk declared that American blood had been shed on American soil. That claim mattered because many Americans did not buy it. Northern Whigs looked at the war and saw not a defensive necessity, but an expansionist project designed to enlarge the world of slavery. Abraham Lincoln, still a congressman at that point, used his spot resolutions to challenge Polk's narrative and demand to know where the supposed attack had happened. That dispute is historically significant for more than partisan drama. It reminds us that war is always about power twice over. First is there power exercised on the battlefield. Then there is the power to define what the war means. Polk wanted the war to mean honor and defense. His critics wanted to mean aggression and slaveholder ambition. The AP exam loves questions about causation and perspective, and the Mexican-American War is a perfect place to practice both. The war ended with a huge territorial gain for the United States. Under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, Mexico had accepted the Rio Grande boundary, ceded California, New Mexico, and the rest of the Southwest. The United States added an enormous chunk of the continent in a single stroke. On the surface, that looked like a national triumph, but think historically, not just geographically. More land did not equal more unity. More land meant more decision points. More land meant more chances for the slavery issue to move from one compromise to the next. More land meant more conflict with native peoples already living there and more tension with Mexico that would never fully disappear. Expansion created size. It also created instability. That instability showed up immediately in the Wilmot Proviso, which tried to ban slavery in any territory taken from Mexico. It failed. But failure did not mean irrelevance. Quite the opposite. It signaled that the central issue of national politics had shifted. The old question had often been whether slavery would be tolerated where it already existed. The new question was whether slavery would expand. That difference is everything. A system many had treated as regionally contained was now tied directly to the national future. Southerners increasingly insisted that restricting slavery's expansion violated their constitutional rights. Northerners increasingly feared that every new territorial gain would strengthen a slaveholding elite. The same expansion that had been sold as a national destiny was now reorganizing the political map around sectional suspicion. The Free Soil movement captured that shift. Its slogan, "Free soil, free labor, free men," sounds broad and noble until you look closely and realize how limited it often was. Many free soilers did not demand immediate abolition in the South. Many were not committed to racial equality. They wanted the West reserved for free labor and often for white opportunity. That tension matters because it teaches one of the most important lessons in APUSH. Opposition to the expansion of slavery was not always the same thing as support for black equality. You can oppose one form of hierarchy while still defending another. American political reform is full of these layered motives. Then came California, and with it crises. The gold rush exploded migration into the region, and California soon sought admission as a free state. That threatened the balance in the Senate between free and slave states, a balance that had already been psychologically essential to sectional politics. Remember what this means. The nation was no longer arguing simply over principles. It was arguing over arithmetic, over how many senators each side would command, over whether the federal government itself would tilt toward one labor system or the other. That is why the Compromise of 1850 matters so much. It admitted California as free, organized Utah and New Mexico with popular sovereignty, banned the slave trade in Washington, D.C., and imposed a harsher Fugitive Slave Act. Compromise in American history often postpones more than it solves, and the Fugitive Slave Act proves the point. It transformed the North into a hunting ground for runaways and forced people who considered themselves far from slavery into immediate contact with its violence. Alleged fugitives could not testify fully in their own defense. Jury protections were gutted. Northerners who aided escapees could be punished. The Underground Railroad kept operating. Personal liberty laws appeared. Vigilance committees formed, and moderate Northerners who had once preferred distance found themselves drawn closer to anti-slavery resistance. That is historical causation at its sharpest. A law meant to secure the institution of slavery instead helped nationalize moral opposition to it. Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin widened that transformation. It brought the human suffering of slavery into parlors and drawing rooms for readers who might never set foot on a plantation. Students sometimes worry about whether a novel counts as real political history. It does, because history is not shaped by laws and battles. It is shaped by imagination, emotion, and moral argument. Stowe helped turn slavery from a constitutional problem into a moral spectacle for Northern readers. Once people begin to feel the issue, compromise becomes even more fragile. Meanwhile, attempts to keep expanding did not calm anything. The Ostend Manifesto, which suggested the United States should try to buy Cuba from Spain or take it if necessary, fed Northern fears of a slave empire. The Gadsden Purchase looked smaller on the map, but it still reminded Americans that territory and slavery had become inseparable in public life. Then Stephen Douglas introduced the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854, ostensibly to organize the territories and support a railroad route. But to win Southern support, the bill allowed popular sovereignty there and effectively repealed the Missouri Compromise line. That was a turning point. It was not merely a policy change. It was an announcement that an older settlement would no longer hold. The reaction was explosive. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers flooded into Kansas. Rival governments formed. Violence broke out in the sack of Lawrence and John Brown's retaliatory killings at Pottawatomie Creek. Bleeding Kansas was a warning that the nation was running out of peaceful ways to decide the issue. And notice how often in American history, local violence previews national violence. What happened in Kansas did not stay in Kansas. Charles Sumner denounced the brutality on the Senate floor, and Preston Brooks beat him nearly to death with a cane inside the Capitol. The political system itself was beginning to act out of the breakdown it was supposed to prevent. The old party structure could not survive this. The Whigs collapsed under the strain. The Republican Party emerged in the North, committed above all to stopping the extension of slavery into the territories. This is why party realignment matters so much in APUSH. When the party system changes, it usually means the underlying questions of the society have become too large for the old coalitions to contain. The new Republicans were not united on every issue, but they were united enough around the territorial slavery question to create a new sectional political force. Southerners noticed immediately that a party could now rise to national power while being rooted primarily in one section of the country. Then came Dred Scott in 1857, one of the most catastrophic Supreme Court decisions in American history. Roger Taney hoped to settle the slavery question. Instead, he radicalized it. The court declared that black people could not be citizens as the Constitution understood the term. that Dred Scott had no standing to sue, and that Congress had no authority to prohibit slavery in the territories beyond the Northwest framework. The Missouri Compromise, already politically shattered, was now judicially destroyed. This is another recurring APUSH pattern. Institutions created to stabilize a republic can deepen crises when they try to close the argument prematurely. Taney intended finality. He delivered escalation. The Lincoln-Douglas debates followed in that atmosphere. Stephen Douglas tried to salvage popular sovereignty through the Freeport Doctrine, arguing that territories could still limit slavery by refusing to enact supporting laws. Lincoln used the debates to rise from regional politician to national figure by framing slavery's expansion as the central moral and political question of the age. He was not yet calling for immediate racial equality in a modern sense, and that complexity matters. But he did understand that the nation could not continue indefinitely with slavery treated as both wrong in principle and expanding in practice. John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry pushed Southern fear even further. To many white Southerners, the raid confirmed that anti-slavery ideas inevitably led to violent attack. To many Northerners, Brown became a martyr. That split interpretation between martyr and terrorist tells you how far apart the sections had moved. So when Lincoln won the election of 1860 as the candidate of the Republican Party, many Southern leaders interpreted it not merely as a political defeat, but as proof that the balance of the Union had been lost. And this is where it's important to be precise. Secession was fundamentally about slavery. Southern declarations said so in one form or another, whether emphasizing the threat posed by Lincoln, the fear that slavery's expansion would be blocked, or the claim that Northern hostility to the Fugitive Slave Act violated the constitutional protections they expected. Arguments about states' rights existed, but states' rights here were not abstract. They were being invoked in defense of slave property and slave society. Fort Sumter turned crises into war. Lincoln still insisted at first that the central goal was to preserve the Union, not immediately abolish slavery everywhere. That was partly conviction, partly strategy. He needed the border states. He needed Northern Democrats. He needed time. War often narrows political options before it clarifies them. The Confederacy entered the conflict with some advantages, especially defensive strategy, military leadership, and home terrain. But the Union possessed greater population, industry, rail networks, naval strength, and eventually the ability to turn emancipation into both military and moral power. The Civil War is where federal power expands under pressure in ways that would have been difficult to imagine in peacetime. Lincoln suspended habeas corpus in places, enlarged the army, declared a blockade, and tolerated limits on civil liberties that would have been shocking in ordinary times. This is one of those themes that runs across the entire course. War changes the scale of government. It centralizes decision-making. It tests constitutional limits. The Civil War did not simply preserve the Union, it transformed the capacity of the federal state. The battlefield story matters too, not as a list of names to memorize, but as a sequence of turning points. Bull Run shattered the fantasy of a quick conflict. Antietam gave Lincoln the opening he needed. Gettysburg and Vicksburg in 1863 broke Southern momentum and gave the Union control of the Mississippi. Sherman's march made clear that the Union was now willing to wage a harder, more destructive war against the Confederacy's capacity to continue. This was a modern war in the sense that it demanded mass mobilization, industrial production, rail transport, taxation, finance, and political endurance. The Union was not winning only because of better generals at key moments. It was winning because a modernizing society with more resources could eventually bring those resources to bear. Emancipation changed everything. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation did not free every enslaved person immediately. and students should always remember its limits. It applied to rebel territory, not loyal border states. It was justified as a wartime necessity, but those limits do not erase its significance. It transformed the moral language of the war. It discouraged European aid to the Confederacy. It encouraged self-emancipation by people fleeing to Union lines, and it opened the way for black military service on a massive scale. Frederick Douglass understood that if black men fought for the Union, they would make a claim on citizenship no rhetoric could easily deny. Roughly 180,000 African American soldiers and thousands more sailors served, even while facing discrimination, unequal pay, and intense prejudice. The war to save the Union had become, undeniably, a war that struck at slavery. That transformation also sharpened what the Union victory would mean. The Civil War settled some questions with terrible clarity. Secession was defeated. Nullification as a practical doctrine was crushed. Slavery as a legal institution was abolished through the 13th Amendment. But victory did not settle the question of freedom's content. What would citizenship mean? Would the South simply return with slavery gone but racial hierarchy intact? Would land be redistributed? Would the federal government actively protect the rights of the freed people? Would the old planter class regain power? These were not side questions after Appomattox. They were the central questions of Reconstruction. Reconstruction is one of the most misunderstood parts of APUSH because students are sometimes taught to race through it as a short epilogue to the Civil War. It was not an epilogue. It was the struggle over what the Civil War had actually accomplished. The Freedmen's Bureau tried to provide aid, education, and basic support to former slaves and poor whites. Its educational impact was profound. The hope of 40 acres and a mule symbolized something even larger. The idea that true freedom might require an economic foundation, not just legal release from bondage. But land redistribution barely happened. That failure mattered because freedom without secure access to land or capital left many freed people vulnerable to new forms of dependence. Andrew Johnson made that vulnerability worse. He was not a Confederate, but he was a Southern Democrat with deep hostility toward black political equality and broad leniency toward former Confederate leadership. He recognized reconstructed governments quickly and pardoned many former rebels. Southern elites moved fast to reassert control. Black codes tried to lock African Americans into a dependent labor system, restrict movement, deny jury service, and keep land ownership difficult. Sharecropping spread, not as slavery reborn in identical form, but as an exploitative arrangement that trapped many black families and many poor white families in debt and dependency. This is why historians talk about continuity and change together. Slavery ended, the labor hierarchy did not disappear. Congressional Republicans, especially the radical Republicans, responded by trying to seize control of Reconstruction from Johnson. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 asserted citizenship for African Americans. The 14th Amendment wrote birthright citizenship, equal protection, and due process into the Constitution, overturning Dred Scott and redefining the national state. The Reconstruction Acts divided the South into military districts and required new constitutions and black male suffrage for readmission. Then the 15th Amendment prohibited denial of the vote on the basis of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. These amendments are some of the most important constitutional changes in the entire course. They represent not just post-war repair, but a second founding, a redefinition of who the United States claimed to be. And for a brief time, that redefinition produced astonishing changes. African American men voted, held local office, served in state legislatures, and even entered Congress. Hiram Revels took the Senate seat once held by Jefferson Davis. Republican governments in the South rested on coalitions of black voters. White Southern Unionists called scallywags and Northern migrants called carpetbaggers. Reconstruction was not perfect and not corruption-free, but it was real. It opened political space that had never existed before in Southern history. It briefly rearranged the relationship between race and power. That is exactly why white supremacist resistance was so violent. The Ku Klux Klan and similar groups used intimidation, murder, and terror to destroy black political participation and to undermine Republican governments. Federal force acts under Grant temporarily suppressed some of that violence, and that matters because one of the big APUSH questions is always what the federal government is willing and unwilling to do. For a moment, it was willing to use force to protect a multiracial democracy in the South. But willingness in one year does not guarantee endurance in the next. Northern fatigue, economic crises, and political corruption eroded support. The Panic of 1873 redirected national attention toward debt, currency, railroads, and recovery. Grant himself was not the architect of corruption, but scandals around his administration damaged Republican credibility. By the mid-1870s, many Northern voters cared less about enforcing Reconstruction than about stability, growth, and scandal reform. That shift is one of the saddest patterns in the whole course. High principle runs into exhaustion. Rights that require active protection decay when the protecting coalition loses focus. The election of 1876 and the Compromise of 1877 marked the political end of Reconstruction. Federal troops were withdrawn. White Southern redeemers regained control, but the process had been underway even before the formal compromise. Once federal will weakened, segregation, violence, and local political suppression accelerated. The Civil Rights Act of 1875 was rarely enforced and then gutted by the civil rights cases of 1883. Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896 gave constitutional blessing to segregation under the lie of separate but equal. Poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, and terror stripped away voting rights. Here is the essential historical point. Reconstruction did not fail because the amendments were meaningless. It failed because rights written on paper required enforcement, and enforcement collapsed. Still, those amendments were not empty. Their language survived. Their promise survived. The 14th and 15th Amendments would later become the legal basis for 20th century civil rights victories. That is why historians have to think across time. A defeat in one era can become a legal resource in another. Reconstruction was crushed as a living political order in the 19th century, but it was not erased from constitutional memory. And now we arrive at one of the most important transitions in the entire APUSH course. The end of Reconstruction does not create peace. It clears the ground for a new order. The nation that comes out of the 1870s is simultaneously post-war and aggressively modernizing. The South is resubordinating through Jim Crow and sharecropping. The North and Midwest surge ahead industrially. The West is being seized, organized, fenced, mined, and connected by railroad. The federal government, which had shown immense capacity during the war, now often retreats from social justice while still subsidizing development. In other words, the post-war republic becomes the Gilded Age. The word gilded matters because it suggests a surface shine over deeper rot. The late 19th century produced rail magnates, soaring production, new inventions, booming cities, and extraordinary wealth. It also produced corruption, speculative collapse, labor violence, and staggering inequality. The federal government was not absent. That is a myth. It granted land and loans to railroad companies, passed protective tariffs, created national banking structures, and helped shape Western development. but it often used its powers more readily to support capital and expansion than to protect workers or black citizens. Railroads were central to that transformation. They unified the domestic market, standardized time zones, linked raw materials to factories and cities to hinterlands, and helped turn the United States into an integrated national economy. They also became laboratories for the modern corporation, with complex management systems, large capital flows, stock ownership, and fierce competition. The first transcontinental railroad, completed in 1869, symbolized national connection. It also symbolized exploitation, subsidy, corruption, and conquest. Irish laborers, Chinese laborers, and others built the lines. Native lands were split open by them. Buffalo herds were devastated alongside their advance. Markets expanded because older worlds were being dismantled. Industrialization accelerated across steel, oil, coal, and communications. Alexander Graham Bell's telephone and Thomas Edison's light bulb represent more than invention trivia. They stand for a society in which daily life was being reorganized by technology, communication, speed, factory systems, and urban infrastructure. By 1900, the United States would be the leading industrial power in the world. But the road there ran through concentrated wealth. Men like John D. Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie became symbols of innovation and domination. Horizontal integration allowed control over competition. Vertical integration allowed control over production from raw material to finished product. Big business became not just an economic reality, but a political presence. Defenders of that world use the language of laissez-faire, social Darwinism, and the gospel of wealth. The state, they argued, should leave business alone. Competition would reward the fit. Great fortunes could even be justified if the wealthy later used them for philanthropy. But critics saw something else. They saw monopolies that fixed prices and crushed rivals. They saw workers facing long hours, unsafe conditions, blacklists, court injunctions, and replacement labor. They saw vast new wealth appearing alongside slums, tenements, and children working in factories. They saw that the industrial order was not simply producing prosperity, it was also concentrating power. Labor conflict followed naturally. The Great Railroad Strike of 1877, Haymarket in 1886, Homestead in 1892, and Pullman in 1894 were not isolated eruptions. They were signs that industrial capitalism had created a new class conflict at national scale. The National Labor Union, the Knights of Labor, and the American Federation of Labor represented different attempts to organize workers under brutal conditions. Some unions tried to include a broad laboring public. Others focused narrowly on skilled workers and wages. Employers used private guards, court orders, and state force. Presidents sent troops. Public opinion often turned against labor after episodes of violence, which made it easier to paint unions as radical even when their demands were basic. This matters because it connects directly to the next era. The progressive movement will not appear out of nowhere. It will emerge from precisely these tensions over labor, monopoly, urban misery, and regulatory failure. The Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 looked like a response to corporate concentration, but in practice it was initially weak against corporations and sometimes more effective against unions. The Interstate Commerce Act created the ICC, an important regulatory landmark, but it too was limited at first. These half measures are historically significant because they show the federal government beginning to acknowledge that unregulated capitalism could distort society, even if it was not yet willing to intervene forcefully enough to change the balance of power. Cities swelled in the meantime. Industrial jobs and transportation networks pulled migrants in from farms, small towns, and foreign countries. By the late 19th century, the United States was urbanizing rapidly. Skyscrapers and electric streetcars changed space itself. Ethnic neighborhoods formed, tenements packed families into unhealthy conditions, political machines like Tammany Hall mixed welfare, patronage, corruption, and neighborhood power in ways that made them despised by reformers and indispensable to many of the poor. Again, avoid moral simplification. Machine politics stole enormously, but it also fed people, found jobs, and helped immigrants navigate a bewildering new world. Immigration reshaped everything. Earlier immigrants from Ireland, Germany, and Britain had already transformed American life. Now, increasing numbers arrive from Southern and Eastern Europe, from Italy, Russia, Poland, Greece, and elsewhere. Many were Catholic, Orthodox, or Jewish. Many were poor. Many were treated by older stock Americans as racially inferior or politically dangerous. Ellis Island became a gateway. Nativism rose sharply. Chinese immigrants, who had already played a major role in mining and railroad construction in the West, faced especially vicious exclusion. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 marked the first major federal immigration restriction based on race and nationality. That is a critical moment because it shows the federal government not merely tolerating racial hierarchy, but actively codifying it in immigration law. Urban reform efforts began to appear in response. The social gospel called on Christians to confront poverty and social suffering rather than treat them as private failures. Settlement houses, most famously Jane Addams' Hull House, tried to provide services, education, and support within immigrant communities. These are previews of the progressive era. The late 19th century produced the social problems that reformers would soon try to solve more systematically. Meanwhile, the West remained no empty safety valve. The myth itself needs to be challenged. The federal government promoted Western settlement through the Homestead Act and the Pacific Railway Act. Miners rushed to places like Colorado and Nevada. Cattle boomed and busted. Barbed wires fenced what had once been imagined as an open range. Women in some Western territories gained voting rights earlier than women elsewhere. Mexican vaqueros, African American cowboys, Chinese laborers, Mormons, migrants from Europe, and settlers from the East all shaped the region. The West was diverse, commercial, violent, and deeply tied to federal policy. But the most important story in the late 19th century West is the destruction of native life. Plains societies had adapted over time to horses, firearms, and bison-centered mobility. Railroad expansion, military campaigns, deliberate bison destruction, reservation confinement, broken treaties, and settler pressure shattered that world. Sand Creek, Little Bighorn, the flight of the Nez Perce under Chief Joseph, the Ghost Dance movement, and the massacre at Wounded Knee reveal a brutal truth. The so-called closing of the frontier was not the peaceful settlement of unused land. It was the violent defeat of native resistance and the forced restructuring of native life under federal authority. Assimilation policy made that violence more bureaucratic, but not more humane. The Dawes Act tried to end tribal landholding by dividing reservation land into individual allotments, rewarding those who adopted what officials called civilized habits, and opening the remaining land to white settlement. Boarding schools tried to erase native language and culture in the name of education. This is another important APUSH pattern. The language of reform and civilization can function as an instrument of domination when one group assumes it has the right to remake another. Farmers in the West and South also felt increasingly squeezed. Their world was being commercialized faster than it was being protected. They faced falling crop prices, high transportation costs, tight money, heavy debt, and unfair railroad practices. The Grange began as a social and educational movement, but soon pushed for regulation. The Farmers' Alliances went further. The Populist Party translated agrarian frustration into a national political program, calling for government ownership of railroads, free silver, a graduated income tax, and the direct election of senators. Listen to that list carefully, and you can already hear the future. Some of these demands will later become mainstream reform. What looks radical in one decade can become common sense in another. The election of 1896 is therefore one of the great transition points. William Jennings Bryan gave the Cross of Gold speech and voiced the fury of people who felt the financial system had been rigged against producers and debtors. William McKinley represented a more conservative, business-aligned industrial future. McKinley's victory mattered because it signaled the United States was moving toward a new political order, one more comfortable with big business, high tariffs, and a modern industrial economy than with an agrarian insurgency. The populace faded as an independent force, but many of their ideas did not disappear. They were absorbed, revised, and carried forward into progressive reform. There is another layer to the collapse of the old political order that students should keep in view. The 1850s were not just about slavery in the abstract. They were about the death of a national party system that had once helped contain sectional anger. The Whigs had included both Northern and Southern members, and as long as those coalitions could survive, they gave Americans a way to disagree without dividing cleanly by region. But slavery in the territories destroyed that balance. The Know-Nothings tried to redirect attention toward anti-immigrant and anti-Catholic politics. Yet even that movement could not permanently replace the deeper sectional issue. Once the Republican Party emerged as a Northern party opposed to slavery's expansion, the once Southern Democrats hardened in defense of that expansion. The Union lost one of its most important stabilizers. That is, one reason the election of 1860 felt so catastrophic, it was not only that Lincoln won, it was that he won in a party system that now reflected sectional geography with frightening clarity. That makes the secession winter between 1860 and 1861 especially important. There was still room, technically, for compromise. The Crittenden proposals tried one last time to restore a Missouri-style line and guarantee slavery where it already existed. But by then the crisis had outgrown the language of temporary settlement. Southerners who wanted secession no longer trusted containment. Republicans no longer wanted to bless the indefinite expansion of slavery. What had once been treated as a constitutional disagreement had become a struggle over the future social order of the continent. That is why compromise failed. Not because Americans had forgotten how to bargain, but because the thing being bargained over had become too fundamental. The war years then drove home another major APUSH theme. War creates constitutional precedents that outlast the war itself. Lincoln's administration did not just defeat the Confederacy militarily. It normalized a far more energetic use of national authority. The federal government issued greenbacks, passed the National Bank Act, approved the Pacific Railway Act, passed the Homestead Act, and used the Morrill Tariff to help finance the war and protect Northern industry. These policies matter because they show that even while the South was absent from Congress, Republicans were building the framework of a new national economy. The Civil War was therefore not only a battle over secession and slavery, it was also an accelerator of modernization. It helped create the economic architecture of the Gilded Age. The New York City draft riots reveal how unevenly Northern society experienced that modernization and that war. Conscription fell heavily on ordinary men, and the ability of the wealthy to hire substitutes made class resentment explode. Irish immigrants, already precarious in urban labor markets, often feared that emancipation would intensify competition for work. In 1863, those fears and resentments erupted into racialized mob violence against African Americans and symbols of privilege. That episode matters because it reminds us that the Union cause, even after emancipation, did not rest on unanimous Northern anti-racism. The North fought slavery and still contained profound racial prejudice. The Union victory was morally transformative, but the society achieving it remained deeply conflicted. And yet emancipation changed the stakes so dramatically that it also changed the meaning of military service. The 54th Massachusetts became famous for a reason. Black enlistment made abstract arguments about freedom tangible and public. African American soldiers were not simply assisting the Union war effort, they were forcing the nation to confront the contradiction between black sacrifice and second-class status. When Frederick Douglass urged black men to fight, he understood that citizenship in the United States had often followed military service and patriotic claim-making. The war did not automatically grant equality, but it created a far more powerful political claim to it. Even Appomattox did not instantly decide how the post-war South would be reorganized. Lincoln's own wartime plans had been relatively lenient and built around the 10% formula and rapid restoration once loyalty and emancipation were acknowledged. The Wade-Davis position demanded a far harder approach and reflected the growing conviction among congressional Republicans that the defeated South could not simply be trusted to rebuild itself. Lincoln's assassination therefore matters not only because it removed a president at a pivotal moment. It removed the one figure who might have mediated between leniency and transformation in a distinctive way. Andrew Johnson inherited the office without Lincoln's moral authority or political skill, and the result was collision with Congress. That collision became one of the clearest examples in APUSH of conflict among the branches of government. Johnson vetoed measures extending the Freedmen's Bureau and protecting civil rights. Congress overrode him, asserting legislative supremacy in a way that would have been astonishing before the war. Then came the Reconstruction Act of 1867, military districts, black suffrage requirements, and eventually Johnson's impeachment after he violated the Tenure of Office Act. He survived removal by a single vote. But the deeper meaning had already been established. Reconstruction was not simply a Southern question, it was a national constitutional struggle over which branch would define freedom after the Civil War. The brief success of Reconstruction governments deserves more than a passing glance because later narratives so often reduce them to corruption or failure. They established public schools in many places where education had been limited. They expanded state responsibilities. They created a genuinely new electorate. They showed, however briefly, that the post-war South could contain a multiracial politics backed by the federal state. The election of black office holders and the participation of freedmen in public life were not anomalies. They were glimpses of a different American future. That future was violently attacked, but the fact that it briefly existed matters historically. It proves that Jim Crow was not inevitable, it was built. And it was built through both violence and law. The Klan, night riding, murder, intimidation, and election fraud did one part of the work. Supreme Court decisions and local state legislation did the rest. This is a pattern students should recognize across the whole course. Rights can be destroyed not only by mobs, but by institutions deciding not to defend them. Once the court narrowed the meaning of the 14th Amendment in the 1880s, and once states perfected disfranchisement through taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses, white supremacy no longer depended solely on informal terror. It became embedded in legal structure. That is why the rise of Jim Crow is not just a social story, it is a constitutional story. The phrase New South captures another important illusion. Southern boosters promised industrial growth, rail links, and regional renewal. But for huge numbers of Southerners, especially black Southerners, life remained tied to cotton, debt, and the land they did not own. Sharecropping and tenant farming preserved economic dependence even after slavery had ended. The South, therefore, changed and did not change at the same time. Slavery was gone, racial subordination remained, industrial rhetoric grew. Agrarian poverty persisted. That kind of mixed continuity and change is exactly what APUSH essays are asking you to notice. Gilded Age national politics carried the same doubleness. At the presidential level, the era can look almost dull at first glance, a sequence of Hayes, Garfield, Arthur, Cleveland, Harrison, Cleveland again, and then McKinley. but the quiet surface hid major disputes over tariffs, patronage, currency, pensions, and the proper relationship between government and business. Garfield's assassination pushed civil service reform forward through the Pendleton Act. Cleveland defended a hard version of laissez-faire even while signing the Interstate Commerce Act. Harrison presided over the so-called billion-dollar Congress. What looks bland becomes much more interesting once you realize the national government was being pulled between older limited government assumptions and newer demands created by industrial society. And the money question mattered enormously. Farmers and debtors preferred a looser money supply because inflation could make debts easier to pay. Creditors and financial conservatives preferred hard money, especially gold, because it protected the values of loans and savings. That debate appears in the Panic of 1873 in the Greenback controversy, in later silver politics, and in Bryan's campaign. Students often treat currency as a dry economic issue, but it was not dry at all for people living it. It was about whether the financial system would favor borrowers or lenders, producers or bankers, countryside or city. In other words, it was another version of the older question of who the Republic was for. Industrial ideology also deserves a closer look because it shaped how Americans interpreted suffering. Horatio Alger's stories reinforce the belief that hard work and honesty would naturally lead to success. Carnegie's Gospel of Wealth justified great fortunes by claiming the rich had a moral obligation to use them wisely. Social Darwinists adapted Darwinian language into defense of hierarchy, suggesting that great wealth and great poverty reflected natural competition rather than political choice. But critics like Henry George and Edward Bellamy were already exposing the moral and structural problems of that worldview. Their arguments mattered because they helped make inequality visible as a social construction rather than a law of nature. That is one of the great intellectual bridges into progressivism. The labor movement, too, was more ideologically varied than students sometimes remember. The Knights of Labor tried to unite workers broadly, including many who were excluded elsewhere, and reflected a moral critique of the industrial order as much as a narrow economic one. The AFL under Samuel Gompers focused more pragmatically on bread-and-butter issues such as wages, hours, and working conditions, especially for skilled workers. Those different strategies were responses to the same basic reality. Industrial capitalism had reorganized life so thoroughly that workers now had to think collectively if they wanted any leverage at all. Employers knew that too, which is why union busting became such a central feature of the era. The violence of the big strikes also revealed to a degree in which the state was not neutral. Hayes used federal troops in the Great Railroad Strike. State power and private power worked together at Homestead. Federal troops and injunctions crushed Pullman under Cleveland. That matters because one of the easiest mistakes in APUSH is to imagine laissez-faire as simple governmental absence. In practice, laissez-faire often meant selective governmental presence, restrained when ordinary people needed protection, forceful when capital and order were threatened. Urban life transformed culture as well as economics. Cities brought strangers into daily proximity. They compressed class, ethnicity, religion, and language into dense neighborhoods. They made conspicuous wealth and visible poverty unavoidable. Electric lights, telephones, streetcars, and skyscrapers changed the physical experience of time and space. Women found new opportunities in cities as wage earners and consumers, even while still constrained by older gender expectations. That transition matters because it helps explain why later reform movements, women's movements, and cultural conflicts would often be rooted in urban experiences. Immigration intensified all of that. New arrivals did not simply add a population. They reshaped American labor markets, politics, religion, and identity. They filled factories, dug sewers, built neighborhoods, joined political machines, founded churches and mutual aid societies, and changed what American cities sounded like and looked like. Nativists responded by describing them as unassimilable, dangerous, and alien to American values. Those accusations had racial, economic, religion, and political dimensions all at once. Late 19th century nativism was therefore not just prejudice in the abstract. It was a political reaction to rapid demographic change in a society already strained by inequality. The so-called old immigrant and new immigrant contrast mattered because it allowed early arrivals and native-born Protestants to treat their own presence as normal, while marking newcomers as the problem. But from a larger historical perspective, both waves were part of the same long process. The United States was becoming more diverse, more urban, more ethnically layered, and less easily defined as an Anglo-Protestant republic. That is a deep continuity from the colonial era, when diversity already complicated British North America. But by the 1880s and 1890s, it was happening at a scale that made the politics of identity even more intense. The West, too, needs to be stripped of myth. Dime novels and paintings celebrated cowboys, open space, and freedom. But the actual West was a zone of federal policy, commodity booms, ethnic diversity, and environmental strain. Mining devastated landscapes. Cattle empires rose and fell with the weather and markets. Chinese immigrants were crucial and then targeted. Mexican traditions remained central to ranching life. African American cowboys were present in significant numbers. Mormons built communities that unsettled outsiders with their religious traditions and polygamy. Women in some Western territories gained political rights earlier than in the East. The West was less a simple frontier than a contested social laboratory. And for Native peoples, the closing decades of the 19th century were catastrophic precisely because federal policy shifted from warfare to imposed transformation without ever abandoning coercion. After open conflict came allotment. After reservation confinement came boarding school assimilation. After military defeat came cultural attack. Students should notice that logic remained consistent. Whether through cavalry, treaty pressure, buffalo destruction, or school discipline, the goal was to make native autonomy disappear. The farmer insurgencies of the 1870s through the 1890s, therefore, belong in the same story as labor unrest, urban reform, and antitrust politics. Farmers were not outside modern capitalism. They were inside it and often crushed by its price system, debt structure, and transportation networks. Their protests reveal that industrial America did not simply divide into factory owners and factory workers. It also included commercial farmers who felt themselves becoming dependent on railroads, banks, and distant markets they could not control. The populace tried to build a democratic counterforce to that reality. They did not fully succeed electorally, but they helped train Americans to think that concentrated economic power might need a concentrated democratic response. And that is why 1896 leads so directly to the next chapter. McKinley's victory did not erase the grievances of laborers, farmers, reformers, or black Americans living under terror. It merely showed that the first political response to industrial modernity would be more conservative and corporate than insurgent and agrarian. But the problems remained. Monopolies remained. Urban misery remained. Unsafe workplaces remained. Jim Crow remained. Native dispossession remained. Nativism remained. The country had chosen a path, but it had not solved the crises created by the path. So what do periods 5 and 6 mean together? They are the story of a republic forced to decide whether expansion and freedom could exist with slavery, then forced to decide whether freedom without equality was freedom at all, and then forced again to decide whether industrial growth without social justice could really count as national success. These periods are tied together by the same underlying struggles over land, labor, law, and belonging. Manifest Destiny intensifies sectional conflict. The Civil War destroys slavery and expands federal power. Reconstruction tries to redefine citizenship and democracy. Its collapse clears the way for Jim Crow and a new industrial order. Industrial capitalism enriches the nation and deepens inequality. Western expansion creates opportunity for some and catastrophe for others. Immigration powers cities and triggers nativism. Labor organizes and is crushed, then organizes again. Farmers protest and lose elections, yet plant seeds for future reform. And this is the part students need to feel, not just remember. The United States after 1898 is not simply bigger than it was in 1844. It was different in structure. It has a far stronger national government than the one that existed before the Civil War, even if that government often chooses not to protect the most vulnerable. It has a continental economy tied together by railroads, corporations, and national markets. It has a constitutional framework reshaped by the Reconstruction Amendments, even if those promises are being betrayed in practice. It has massive cities, industrial fortunes, unions, immigrant neighborhoods, reservation systems, segregated southern regimes, and new arguments about regulation, inequality, and national purpose. In other words, it has become recognizably modern. But it has become modern through contradiction. Freedom after emancipation coexists with disfranchisement and terror. Economic growth coexists with tenements and strikes. Westward opportunity coexists with massacres and allotment. Democracy expands and retracts at the same time. The Republic has solved the question of disunion by force, but it has not solved the question of justice. It has ended slavery, but not racial hierarchy. It has created national power, but not national fairness. It has produced immense wealth, but not an agreed moral order for distributing it. And that is why this chapter matters so much in the larger APUSH story, because the next installment will inherit almost every major problem born here. The progressives will respond to monopoly, corruption, labor conflict, urban poverty, and unsafe food in workplaces. 20th century civil rights activists will return to the constitutional promises of Reconstruction. Debates over immigration and American identity will intensify. The United States will begin acting more openly as a world power, just as Frederick Jackson Turner declares the frontier closed. Even overseas expansion in the 1890s makes more sense when you see it as a nation carrying outward habits it developed while expanding across the continent. So do not think of periods 5 and 6 as one story ending and another beginning. Think of them as one great transformation. A country that once argued about whether it should go west ends up spanning the continent. A country that once compromised over slavery ends up fighting the bloodiest war in its history over it. A country that briefly imagines interracial democracy in the South abandons it and then pretends the abandonment is normal. A country that destroys one labor system builds another kind of hierarchy through industrial capitalism. A country that once feared centralized authority discovers that centralized authority can build railroads, win wars, protect markets, and still fail to protect justice. By 1898, the United States is no longer a young republic nervously testing itself. It is an industrial continental power with corporate giants, segregated states, organized labor, immigrant cities, reservation borders, and a federal government that has proved both its strength and selectivity. It has settled some questions with rifles and amendments. It has left others festering beneath prosperity and patriotic language, and that is the deepest lesson of this installment. American history does not move from problem to solution in a neat line. It moves from one settlement to the next crisis, from one expansion to the next exclusion, from one promise to the next betrayal, from one unfinished struggle to another. By the end of the 19th century, the nation has been remade, but it has been remade into a place where the biggest questions, wealth and citizenship, race and labor, democracy and power, are not resolved. They are simply entering a new phase.